In this video, we're going to take a look at creating a speaker housing for a door on a car in Fusion 360. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to tackle a subscriber's request where they're asking about creating geometry for a speaker housing on the door of a car. Now, I'm not going to be able to share this data set. This was the scan from the Tesla that I used on the wide body and the spoiler videos. But we will talk about the process a little bit, some things that you should think about, and ultimately maybe some design tips. So, the first thing to think about when you're talking about trying to make a speaker housing for a car door. Now, in this case, we have a scan of the car door, which is the main thing that you need. If you don't have a scan of your car door, then this process is obviously going to be quite a bit more difficult. But with the scan of the door, you need to think about where you're going to place your additional speakers, what kind of room you have inside the vehicle when you shut the door, and ultimately what you're looking to do. So what I've done is I've drawn just a very basic representation of a 5 1/4 speaker, something that you might see in the rear of a vehicle or might get incorporated into a door. The next thing that we need to think about is the space that we have. Are we trying to fit this on top of existing geometry without cutting the door panel at all? Or are we able to hack up and cut the door panel and reshape the geometry to fit what we need? Now, this is a Tesla Model 3 door panel. It already obviously has a speaker, and there's lots of room behind this. So on this car, you could potentially remove that speaker and then create your own snap-in housing if you have the part and add a 5 1/4 and a tweeter or whatever you need to fit in that area. We're not going to tackle that because this scan actually has quite a bit of detail here, and it would be a monumental task to try to fill all that stuff in. So we're going to approach this as if you're adding additional speakers to a design. So what that means is we need to think about the space. Now in this car, the cubby area underneath the handle is going to be a big opening where you could place speakers. Now, the benefit of doing something like that is you could make a drop-in feature that goes into that area. The downside to this is you really don't have any room to build outside of it because in this specific car, it's going to sit right up next to the seat. So we can't build out from there. However, the area above the OEM speaker, there's nothing in terms of controls here. The geometry doesn't close up against the dashboard inside of the car. So what we could do is we could carry the shape of this lower speaker grill and come up and around and sort of restructure that portion of the door. This will allow you to build a separate piece. You might have to relieve or cut some of the geometry behind it, but then you can build out the shape that you want. So those are a couple of considerations that you need to think about. Now, the way we're going to approach this is we're going to use our forms tools and we're going to build the external shape. I'm not going to go over all the details of the internal pieces. We're just going to focus on how we can try to match the geometry, the contours, and carry that shape around. Now, I will have to say that recording this video, other than modeling the speaker, I have not done this yet. So once again, we're going to go in completely fresh. We're going to look at the process, how I would go about creating the initial shapes, and not going to really focus on the basic details like creating an extrude or the hardware that you need to hold this in. A lot of times, some of those portions are going to be hidden. There might be something glued to the backside of a plastic part. That really comes down to how you actually physically build the pieces. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the outside shape because that, I believe, is the most difficult piece. So without any more stalls or discussion, let's go ahead and get started and create a form. I am going to get started by creating a face. And once again, we have object snap, which will let me snap directly to the mesh. So I'm just going to start creating one single face. So we're going to come from here, we're going to come down to this point, and we're going to come over to here. That's one face. Currently, it is snapped to the mesh, which we know is not a constraint. It's not going to keep it there. But what this does is it gives me an initial shape to start working with. I'm also going to change this to box display mode. So I can use Alt and 1 on the keyboard, or I can go to box display mode. It's not really going to make much of a difference at this stage, but once we start adding curvature, it will become more apparent. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to rough out the overall shape. So we want to figure out where it's going to attach to the door and where it's going to sort of follow the contour. So what I envision is that we're going to make a panel that sort of fits like it does here on the right-hand side. And then it's going to sort of wrap around this cubby and come up and follow that door line. So with that in mind, we have a lot of complex curves that we need to fit. The way that we're going to go about this is we always want to try to maintain those four-sided faces or four-sided patches. So we're going to carry on with that sort of methodology until we get into a design decision where we need a try or an end gun, something that has 3 or 5 sides. So the way that I would approach this is I would start dividing this up. So I want to take this face, I want to go modify, insert edge, and just select this edge here and put it right in the middle. And then I'm going to do the same thing at the top and put it right in the middle. So this gives me 4 different sections that I can work with. Now keep in mind that this is still flat, so if I go back to our smooth display, this is going to be, in my mind, bad curvature. It's something that we want to avoid. I'm not going to worry too much about the edges or maintaining those edges where they are. I really want to focus on getting the shape, and then we'll worry about attaching it back to the door after the fact. So I'm going to find this vertice down here, and from the side, I just want to pull that out until I get close to the outside shape of the door. So rotate around, that looks okay. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to take this entire mid edge. I'm going to rotate it around because right now our surface is behind the speaker. I want to get a little bit closer to the outside edge of the speaker. Keep in mind that most speakers will have trims or grills that can go on the outside of them. So I'm going to sort of use this outside portion of the speaker as the guide. That's where I want to sort of end up, considering that we are going to likely put a grill over it. So now that I have that rough shape, I'm going to add some more edges. Keep in mind when we do this, we are trying to avoid flats. So if you do have a flat area, it might be helpful to just tweak the geometry just a little bit. In this case, this is actually reversed curvature. It's still arcing inward, so I can likely pull these out just a bit to get rid of that flat section. So next I'm going to add another edge in here. So once again, we're inserting the edge. I'm going to put it on the other side, roughly halfway. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're moving everything around. And I am still using simple insertion. Now, if you haven't seen any of the other videos, then this might not make sense to you, but simple insertion mode is going to put the edge exactly where we say, and it's just going to divide it up. Now keep in mind that that creates a situation where we have flat faces, and that's bad for curvature. We always want a little bit of deviation between these faces. So to get started, I'm just going to go to this view, pull those out just slightly, so we have a little bit of curvature. And I'll do the same thing in the middle. We're going to finesse the design once we get the rough shape. But right now what we're trying to do is we're trying to build that shape. And once we have the general shape, then we can start worrying about the details. So you don't want to get started with a ton of details and then work yourself into a corner. So if you get the rough shape, and at least at this stage, if you get the rough shape, then we can go back and we can move into creating those fine curves. Now, I think what I want to do here is I really have to consider the size of the speaker. Now, this is going to be problematic because we have a mounting flange that sits way out here. And this means that it's going to be a bit difficult for us to match that curvature, but not impossible. So a couple of ways that we can do this is we can start extruding edges, or we can continue to divide this up and moving things around. I think what I want to do is I want to take this edge and I want to use slide edge and slide it inward a little bit if it'll let me. And you can see that it won't let me slide it inward, but it will let me slide it outward. And when I do that, it's essentially extending that out. Now, a way that we can get around this is by inserting an edge where we want. So find that position, and then we can double click and delete this one. So that pushes that edge back where I want it, and then I don't have to worry about reshaping everything because it still sort of follows that original curvature. Now I want to take this edge and I want to start extruding it. So in order to extrude, we're going to hold down the Alt key and then pull this out to the side. I want to get it to roughly the right position, so I need to find where that bottom edge is going to be right at the front of that cubby, and then I'm going to let go of Alt and begin moving around the other edges. So this edge here is going to have to start to follow this curve. I'm likely going to end up pulling this one back a bit, and what I'm trying to get at here is making sure that the transition between the angles of these faces is as minimal as possible. We're going to have to do a good bit of work to make this sort of complex shape happen, especially around here. But again, we're looking at sort of first steps. Another tip is whenever we want to try to restructure the angles of these, we can always come in and use insert point. For example, if I want that edge to come here, I can add those edges. Now you'll notice at this point it didn't work. Now this has happened, and I did get a comment like this where it wasn't able to make that edge happen. Oftentimes, what happens when you do that, so if I go from here to here, oftentimes what happens is it's not able to divide it up properly. If I say okay, you can see it's not dividing it. When we go into smooth display, sometimes what the issue is that the edge that we're trying to create has this weird overlap with surrounding geometry. So I'm going to go in and select make uniform and use make uniform first, go back to box display and try it one more time. So I'm going to go from that edge down to roughly the middle here and hit enter, and it still doesn't work. If this doesn't work, the next step for me would be to try to select each intermediate edge where I want to go, give it a little bit more of a guide. Now, when that happens, we're going to double click this edge and hit delete and get rid of it. Now, ultimately, that's probably not what I want to do, but just sort of keep in mind how we can manipulate these designs, because oftentimes you're going to have to do a little bit of tweaking here and there before you are happy with the shape. All right, so everything's looking okay so far. I want to begin to pull this back. So I want to pull it back towards the door, keeping in mind that we are going through the speaker. That's okay at this point. Remember, we're roughing out the shape still. We're not anywhere near doing final detail work. So pull that back. As you can kind of see where it starts to intersect the door. I'm just going to get it close. And this is going to be the rough shape that we're creating. If we use Alt and 3, we can see a smooth display and kind of see how that's shaping up. And then if we go to Alt and 1, now we're back to this box display. So now that we have this rough shape, this is where we need to begin dividing it up a bit more. So we want to be happy with all the intermediate curvature at this point. So that means if we need to move anything around, make sure that we do it now. It's going to be much easier for us to get the rough shape now rather than trying to do it later after we begin adding detail. So I want to make sure that I evaluate the shape and I pull this, I'm going to pull this back to the door. Again, just getting it a little bit closer. It doesn't have to be perfect. And we're going to end up pulling a lot of geometry out to match the speaker, but right now that's okay. What I want to do next is add another edge. So I'm going to go to Insert Edge. You can see that it's following the average or the median position between our selected edges. So down here, it looks a bit weird, like there's an extra bump. Now, if this ever happens, what I'm going to do is I want to go in and I want to hide the mesh body, which is the driver's door panel, and I want to find the reason why that's happening. Now, it probably happens simply because there's this extra point here. Now, this happened based on the way in which we originally tried to insert that edge. Now, even though it didn't make the edge, sometimes it can break this up and add this vertex in the middle. If this ever happens, you want to go to Weld Vertices and just push it over to the next one. It really shouldn't have a negative effect on curvature, but you do want to make sure you clean that up. Now, when we insert the edge, you can see it's coming over where it should be. That looks okay. We're going to say okay. I want to bring back my driver's door panel and hide my bodies folder there. So with that in mind, again, we don't want to leave this flat, so we're going to start to use Edit Form and adjust the curvature. I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to pull this one out as well. Now you can see we're starting to encompass the speaker a little bit better. So it's starting to look a little bit better, starting to take shape, but there's still quite a bit to do. Now, if you have made anything with forms at this point, you know that it's not a quick process to do it properly. It does take time, and there are a lot of little details that we need to follow. It looks like I probably need another edge over here. So once again, I'm going to use Insert Edge, and then we're going to just simply move it over where it needs to be. So double click. I'll put it probably a little bit less than halfway, closer to the edge of the speaker. And then I'm going to take this and move it out. And before I go too much further, I think I want to divide up this bottom section as well. So we're slowly dividing this up to get the resolution that we need. And this is going to be something that you want to follow no matter what you're designing. You don't want to go in and just instantly add a ton of divisions because it's much harder to control the shape. You want to get the broad shape done first, then you want to gradually add more detail as you need it. Whenever you need to start to add more edges or curves or whatever the case might be, you want to do that slowly because doing it all at one time is going to be much harder to control the curvature in a meaningful way. So you can see here I'm making some micro adjustments to this middle area because that's going to remain somewhat the same. Now, you will note that there is an ear hanging out here. This is something that is likely to happen. Now, some speakers will have 3 mounting ears, some will have 4, some will have a thinner trim ring. So I'm not worried too much about the mounting ear because I know that there are other options. And because that is a problem, I am not going to worry about that. I'm simply going to worry about the overall speaker, and I'm going to make sure that the lip of the speaker is really what we're focusing on. So if I hide the bodies, I want to make sure that this rounded lip fits inside because I do know that there are variations that have a trim ring that do allow me to mount that way. So keeping that in mind, we're not too worried about that. So now we've got the rough shape going here. The next stage for me is I'm going to go back to my smooth display and just take a look. So in the smooth display, everything is very smooth. That's what we would expect. We're not quite matching the door, but we don't really have the resolution to match the door yet. So as we look at this, we've got a general shape that's working. This works and it flows well with the car. We just need to match the outside shape, which means that we're going to have to subdivide this thing at some point. And then what we want to do is we want to make sure that all the rest of the details are fine. So now at this point that we have the rough shape, the next step for me would be to start to add the hard details that we want. So for example, if we want to carry any of the door lines, which this car, most of it is smoothed out. You can see there's one here. Everything from here up is relatively smooth. So there's not really any hard edges that we need to control. However, we do want to think about the shape in general. If there's anything that we want to adjust or pull, now is the time for us to do it. So we're going to go into Modify, Edit Form. I am going to pull this vertex back down to the door a little bit closer and probably pull this one down a little bit. And just get it a little bit closer to that final shape. So once again, minor adjustments. This corner here, we're not going to be able to take care of until we add more detail, more edges. And it's not something that we want to just go in to try to match the shape. We want to do it slowly. This one here, I'm going to move over just a bit, and that looks okay. So as we look at this, if we want to add any hard details, now would be, we're pretty close to the point where we can do that. So what I mean by hard details is if we want to carry the area where the speaker is a bit further out. So for example, if we take this edge, we're gonna use the bevel tool in this case. So we want to take this edge and we want to select bevel edge. I'm going to pull these relatively close together and say okay, and then take a look at this in smooth display. So if I hide my edges, Control and 4, what we have here is we've got a tighter edge and we can work on the way in which that blends out. So this helps us follow some lines of the car and maybe make a division like this where we can kind of work on having something that flows with the car. This is a difficult task, especially when you're trying to match something that already exists. It does take a little bit of time and a little bit of work. What we can do is Control and Z. I'm going to double click on that. I'm going to use bevel again, and this time I'm going to keep them close together, but instead of one edge, I'm going to add 2 edges. Now, when we add one edge, what it does is it takes away the original edge and it adds 1 on each side. When we add 2 edges, we're going to have a crease in the middle, but keep in mind that these are going to be perfectly flat. And this is where this problem comes in. When we take a look at this in smooth display and we hide our edges with Control 4, you can see that it looks pretty good and it blends away down here and it looks okay. But this is always something that we want to be very careful using, especially overusing. Now, it's going to be okay in this case, and I know in general I always say do not use a flat section between these edges. The reason that it works here is because of the curvature on either side of it, where we've got a curvature coming at an angle in, and then it's a much steeper angle going out. Because these angles are so steep on the entry and the exit, they're so much different. it works there. When it gets to the end here, it doesn't really work as well. Now in Fusion 360, we can do what's called a T-point. So we could get rid of that edge completely and we could take a look at the result. And the T-point will allow it to begin to blend away automatically. So you can kind of see it's wrapping this direction. And we could do the same thing at the top as well. We could find that inside edge, we could delete it, and we could leave what's called a T-point there. So again, Control and 4 to get rid of my edges, and we can work on letting that blend away. To get it to blend away a bit more, I'm going to go back to my box display. From this back view, what I want to do is go to Insert Point, and I'm going to take this point here, and I'm going to try to carry it completely in line and say OK, and then get rid of this one here. So Alt-3 for smooth display, Control-4 to hide my edges. And what that does is it allows us to make that edge begin to disappear a bit sooner. To make it work really well, we need to go into Utilities and make Uniform and allow it to sort of normalize some of those sections. Control and 4 to hide the edges. And you can see that helps keep that edge really close to the speaker. So we are creating sort of a break in the surface. And it's allowing it to blend away because we are going to nice smooth surfaces on the outside. So I think that's a fairly good result. I might want to do something similar on the other side just to give the speaker some deviation. And I have to think about where that makes sense. So what I want to do before that is go to Modify and Insert Edge and just put another edge in there. Once again, we want to make sure that it's not perfectly flat. So you need to come in and make some adjustments. I'm going to take these two edges here and just pull them up slightly, and that should take care of most of it. And then this vertex right in the middle, I'll pull up just slightly and say OK. Then I want to take this edge, modify, bevel. Once again, I'm going to put them relatively close together. I'm going to insert 2. I'm going to say OK. And I'm instantly going to take the ones on the end and delete them so I've got those same T-points. Now, in general, I do not like to use T-points. I like to avoid having those T-points or star points whenever possible. But in this instance, it actually will work fairly well for the geometry we're trying to create. So you can see here this side doesn't have quite as much of a crease. And the reason is because we don't have as drastic a change in direction as we did over here, because this side is relatively flat. So if we want to sort of accentuate that crease a bit more, what we need to do is we need to take these faces or the edges surrounding them, and we're just going to pull them up. And we're going to pull them up, and then I'm also going to take these faces here at the center of the speaker, pull them up a little bit, take these edges, pull them up. And what I'm trying to do is get the angle between here to be a bit more exaggerated. I'm going to take these, pull them up just slightly, and take another look at smooth display. Control 4 to hide my edges. And you can see now we're starting to get that division where we've got that line that's sort of representing where the speaker is. Doing a little bit of work beforehand, before we insert these edges to make sure that they're in the correct place can be helpful. But if you have to fix it after the fact, remember that you always have insert point. So for example, I might want to use insert point and add an edge around there, and then take this edge and delete it. Then I might want to move these two edges, so I'm going to use slide edge and just take them over just slightly. And you can see how that sort of restructures that. So Control and 4, now we're moving that edge around the speaker a little bit. But once again, if you want to highlight that area, then you really need to think about where these edges are. I'm going to do just a little bit more work in this area, and then we're going to move on. So I'm going to go from here, sort of bring this over, and then back. And then I want to get rid of those edges, so delete them. And then once again, I want to insert an edge at the top because I want these to disappear. I'm going to get rid of that one. And I think I don't want this one to be as close, so I'm going to go from here to there and get rid of that. So once again, let's take a look at it in smooth display. I'm going to Control 4 to hide my edges. So I've sort of highlighted that area a little bit more than I normally would. You can see that we've got this sort of the shading going on. If you don't want that crease as tight, then we just need to space the edges out a bit. Using Make Uniform can sometimes help soften that up a bit. because it is sort of normalizing those. So that gives us a little bit more detail on those edges, and I think that looks pretty good so far. So I realize that we haven't saved anything yet, so it's probably a good time to save something. So before we go too much further, we need to fix some of these edges, and we want to make sure that we do that in Box Display. So when I say fix these edges, we've added a lot, and we want to make sure that we are not looking at a completely flat edge. A couple different ways that we can do this. We can try to attach it to the underlying mesh, and we can use tools like match or pull, depending on what your references are. Or we can try to adjust them manually. And I think a good first step is to do it manually to make sure that we're outside of the mesh. And what I want to do is I just want to simply pull each of these vertices to be close to the mesh, but not completely there. Now, one of the reasons I want to do this now is because I need to make sure that we've got the resolution needed to match the curvature of the door. Now, in this case, I can see we're going to need some additional edges to make that happen. And what we can do is we can use our subdivide tool with an exact option, which will keep the current shape that we have. So that's going to be important because we've done some work to make sure that the shape is what we want, and that's exactly what we need before we match anything. But I want to make sure that all of these vertices are in a good position and that they're outside of the mesh and in an area where it's going to make sense for me to attach to. So you can see I'm going to definitely need another edge up here as well. So once we're happy with the overall layout of the shape, we're going to go to Modify and Subdivide. Now for Subdivide, I want to use exact. I don't want to just simply divide it up as is. I want to keep the shape that we have. So we're going to box select all the faces, and you can see how it's dividing this up. You can use Specify, and you can increase or decrease the number of divisions that you have in each segment. Now, if you are trying to match a pretty high resolution mesh underneath, then it's probably going to be important that you do have a lot of divisions. You need to think about the curvature you're trying to match and whether or not you have enough resolution to make that happen. This is going to be probably enough here. So once I have all of that divided up, I'm going to use Control and 4 and Alt and 3, so smooth display, and just kind of take a look at the result before I go too much further. I think it's okay. Obviously, I could spend a bit of time. I will have to confess, I'm not really a car audio person. I don't even really listen to the radio that much in the car, so I've never really worried too much about this. Obviously, in my younger days I did, but now I don't really worry too much about adding additional speakers to vehicles. The sound systems tend to be pretty good. But if you are, then the next step for us is to take a look at our tools. Now, remember that we have two tools. We have Pull and we have Match. Now, remember, Match is looking at the edge of a T-spline body, and it's going to match it with a sketch or edges of a solid or a surface. In this case, our reference is a mesh, so we want to use the Pull tool. Now with the Pull tool, we have to select vertices, and we can select targets, which is going to be pretty difficult because we would need to select specific areas on the mesh, or Auto, which is going to try to pull them down. We do want to think about surface versus control points. Now in this case, we've subdivided this up quite a bit. It's probably not going to make too much of a difference, but in general, you want the surface points to go down to the actual mesh. Now in order to do this, I'm going to change my selection mode to do freeform selection. And I'm going to try to draw a box around the first two rows of vertices here. Now this is going to be pretty tricky. I have to pick the mouse up and try to get just those two rows on the right hand side. And when I do that, you can see that it's instantly starting to pull those down, but it did skip a few. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I go back and I select those. What this is going to do is it's going to pull down just the first two rows of those vertices directly to the underlying mesh. Now the reason that I want to do this is because this will help create a flange, but I need to do this everywhere there's a mesh. Now where it gets tricky is if your mesh is going to roll around a corner, which is part of the reason why you need to go through first and make sure that the edges or the vertices are all in the position that makes sense. Because once you get around a corner where there's a drastic change in curvature, you might not like the results for where it pulls it down. Now, on this section here, I'm only going to do a single edge of vertices. I'm not going to do two. Now, part of the reason is because here at the edge of the door, that's where the door seam is, where the door is closed. You're never going to see this lip. This is going to give us a good attachment point. Over here, we might need to do 2. We just kind of need to look at the results and see how well it fits the car door. Now, I can already tell you that it probably could do with a little bit more subdivision, especially in this area. It's not going to fit very well, but that's kind of beside the point. I doubt that any of you are doing this for a Tesla Model 3. And you can see here that the position of that vertex was not great, so it automatically pulled it down to this inside section, which means that I'm going to go back manually and fix that one because there's not really much I can do with it right now. I do want to make sure that I pull this upper edge, and because the curvature is so flat here, we could get away with 2. But again, the distance between the divisions in this direction are so wide that we probably don't even need to. If you're using double-sided tape or some other attachment method, then you probably are going to be okay with this. Now that brings me to another point while I'm selecting all these vertices, is how are you going to attach this to the vehicle? Now, in a lot of cases, you'll see that these speaker panels and kick panels that are made, they're generally made with MDF. So what they do is they'll stack up the wood, they'll sand it down, and eventually they'll epoxy it, or they'll attach it to the vehicle permanently and use body filler to smooth it all out. Now, in a case like this with this door card, you probably aren't going to do that. If you did, you could simply spend the time forming this out of foam first. That's a great option, is to cover the door panel with something like aluminum foil or shrink wrap, fill it with expandable foam, and then sand it down to the shape you want. Now, obviously, if you do something like that, this needs to be off of the car. You need to remove or cover up areas like the speaker grate that's there and the electronics to make sure that you don't get them filled with Bondo, body filler dust. But that looks pretty good so far. I'm going to say okay. And then once again, I want to fix this area here. Now, this could potentially be tricky because after we subdivided, I didn't move this into position, which means that I likely am going to have to move a couple of these. Now, when we use modify, we can turn on soft modification and determine how we want that to sort of expand from where we are. This rectangular selection allows us to sort of focus on just this row if we want. We can pull this down, and that'll allow us to move a handful of these edges at the same time without having too much of a drastic effect on the curvature. Now, if you don't think that subdividing at this level is going to have a drastic effect on the curvature, well, unfortunately, I got some news for you. It is going to be problematic. So we do want to just move it where we can, and then I am going to pull this in just a bit. I'm going to rotate it, pull it down, get it close to the door. And you can see that we've got some edges that are inside of the mesh. It's just a kind of a product of the way that this works. It's trying to average all of those selections. So you will get some that don't fit quite, they don't fit quite right. But overall, I think that looks pretty good. You can also see that there are some areas here where we've got some change in curvature where we might decide that we want to make some manual modifications so that it fits a little bit better. Again, it's sort of a product of taking those 2 edges down to the door, but likely what I would do is I would make something like this and then I would trim it to fit. It's not going to be a perfect fit, so I might go back and I might just do some manual adjustments. But what we can do is we can find this intermediate edge. I'm going to hold down Shift to deselect the ends since they look to be okay, and then just pull that up. Now, one thing that does tend to happen with a design like this, especially with a high density mesh, you end up getting some of these vertices that move to the mesh on the back side. So this is, if you rotate around, sometimes those edges will get pushed to the back side, some curvature that you don't even see. And in this case, it's probably what happened. So I'm just going to make some manual tweaks, just moving things around till I'm happy with them. And once again, what would likely happen in a case like this is you would do some manual modifications. So let's take this vertex, just bring it down a little bit, and this one down till we're happy with the shape. All right, so everything looks pretty good there. If I hide the edges, Control and 4, you can see that we've got, it's not the best solution because we did have to make some adjustments up here, but we now have something that does fit the car fairly well. You can obviously spend countless number of hours trying to tweak and adjust this. So for example, this entire upper edge, we might decide that we want to scale it to be a little bit more flat and pull it up. Now, likely that will still give you a decent fit because that area is fairly flat. You probably didn't make too many drastic changes that are going to affect it. But areas like this second section, this obviously bulges out, and I might spend some time flattening this out and getting it to come back out toward the speaker a little bit different. But I think that looks okay for a result. Again, we would likely want to trim around the outside. That all can be done after you physically make the part, or you can do it after you finish the form and turn it into a surface. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a sketch. I'm going to select this entire thing, and I'm going to project it. So when we project it, what's happening is we're getting the outside boundary. And what that'll let us do is it'll let us come back in with something like a spline. And we can use tangency with the spline and these outer edges. And we can create our own custom fillet or trim that happens in those corners. So up here, if you don't like the way that the curvature was, then you can come back and add tangency or a curvature relation. And we can use these as trim tools. Now, it's not a perfect solution. Sometimes it won't work. In some cases, you might just find that the geometry does not work. In this case, let's go ahead and try to apply a tangency between this one. That looks okay. I'm not going to do the bottoms. I'm going to leave those alone. But if you do run into a case like this, go to your surface tools, use your trim tool. This is the tool, and that's the section that we want to get rid of. I'm going to repeat that, right-click marking menu. That's the tool. That's the section that we want to get rid of. And then we just go in, find the sketch, and we hide it. So at this point, what we would do is we would thicken this into a solid. Now, it's always a good idea for us to save, so I'm going to do a quick save. We can see the curvature and the geometry that we created. It looks pretty good. Obviously, it needs some work. You can determine whether or not you want to trim and add detail at the surface level and then turn it into a solid, or you can do it as a solid. Either way is perfectly fine. It can also be thickened in the form workspace. It can be done either place. If you do it in the form workspace, it's a little bit difficult to go back and add details after the fact. So in this case, I'm going to bring it out minus, let's say, 0.1. Probably going to be thicker than it needs to be, but bring it out and away from the door. You can see when it did that it produced some ripples or some issues there. So that likely tells me that I probably want to thicken it inward. So I'm going to go positive 0.1. This will thicken it toward the door, and 0.1 is probably a bit thick, maybe 0.05. And you can see here it's giving us an issue. It's telling us that it cannot do that. So what this is telling me is that I probably want to go back and I want to do it at the form level because it'll be a little bit better for it. So we're going to cancel that. Probably going to affect the trim, but at the form level, we can go to Modify, Thicken, select the form body. And if I want to thicken this outward, I'm going to do minus 0.05. And we're going to use the sharp corner or the sharp thicken type. And then finish the form. Now it's going to be a solid. Now the solid, this affects the trim tool because, well, we're not trimming a surface anymore. What we're doing is we're dealing with a solid body. So in the bodies folder, this feature is now a solid body. The sketch should still be valid. If we show the sketch, it should still have those corners. Let's go ahead and view this from the back. Double click the mouse to zoom to fit. And if you want to round these corners off, instead of using trim, you just need to use split body. So we'll select the body to split, the trim tool, and we'll say OK. And what that does is it'll give us that little corner piece that we can remove. Now this gets a little bit trickier because the thicken ends up basically it ends up being normal to the curvature, which means that this sketch, you can see in this case, the sketch is not even in the right position. So we would need to do something else. You could also try to fillet that corner. It tends to be a little bit tricky. The geometry when it's like this tends to not like to be filleted. So you can see here it's not going to work. So you would need to just create another sketch and do that same trim again. At this point, we also want to get rid of the opening for the speaker. Now, a way that we can do this is with a sketch, of course, but we can also just use the speaker directly. So we're going to trim the speaker housing that we created by using split body one more time. This time, instead of a sketch, we'll select this outside cylindrical face, and that will allow us to remove that inside piece. So right-click and remove. So now we've got an opening for the speaker, and again, we can plan out and find another speaker that works for this. The last thing that I want to do here is I'm going to start a sketch directly on this face. I'm going to use my circle tool, so C for circle. I'm going to create a circle that's 4.75, and I'm going to do another one that's a little bit larger. I'm going to say this one is 5 inches. We'll finish the sketch. I'm going to hide the speaker component and show the speaker body. And I want to extrude this little speaker trim that we created here. So I need to go around and select all these profiles. They have these little slots in them. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude that up to an object, and I'm going to join them together. So I just took where the speaker was in 3D, and I made a little trim ring that goes all the way up into that feature. So now we've got one solid body that has that detail in it that's a stop point for the speaker. Obviously, I made it pretty thick. If you were 3D printing this or creating this in some other way, you'd probably want to create some ribs or something on the back. But overall, that is going to be as far as we take this. So we've got our door panel, we've got our speaker housing that we created. You can see that we've added some detail that worked out pretty well. We've added another sort of edge over here just to give it some shape. Obviously, again, you could spend as little or as much time as you want trying to do this, but I think the result for the time spent so far is pretty good. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. As always, this video and a lot of the videos come from questions that we get from subscribers. So if you have a question, feel free to email me, support@caducator.com. I have a pretty long list of them piled up, so it might be a good bit of time before I get to them, but I'm always happy to try to answer questions and make videos whenever possible. So as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.